Bolshevism and Stalinism by Paul Mattick from Anti-Bolshevik Communism. The alleged purpose of Trotsky's biography of Stalin is to show, quote, how a personality of this sort was formed, how it came to power by usurpation of the right to such an exceptional role, end quote. The real purpose of the book, however, is to show why Trotsky lost the power position he temporarily occupied and why his rather than Stalin's name should follow Lenin's. Prior to Lenin's death, it had always been Lenin and Trotsky. Stalin's name had invariably been near or at the end of any list of prominent Bolsheviks. On one occasion, Lenin even suggested that he put his own signature second to Trotsky's. In brief, the book helps to explain why Trotsky was of the opinion, quote, that he was the natural successor to Lenin, end quote, and in effect is a biography of both Stalin and Trotsky. All beginnings are small, of course, and the Bolshevism of Lenin and Trotsky differs from present-day Stalinism, just as Hitler's Brown Terror of 1933 differed from the Nazism of World War II. That there is nothing in the arsenal of Stalinism that cannot be found in that of Lenin and Trotsky is attested to by the earlier writings of Trotsky himself. For example, Trotsky, like Stalin, introduced compulsory labor service as a, quote, socialist principle. He too was convinced, quote, that not one serious socialist will begin to deny to the labor state the right to lay its hands upon the worker who refuses to execute his labor power, end quote. It was Trotsky who hurried to stress the, quote, socialistic character of inequality, or as he said, quote, those workers who do more for the general interest than others receive the right to a greater quantity of the social product than the lazy, the careless, and the disorganizers, end quote. It was his opinion that everything must be done to, quote, assist the development of rivalry in the sphere of production, end quote. Of course, all this was conceived as the, quote, socialist principle of the, quote, transformation period. It was dictated by objective difficulties in the way of full socialization. There was not the desire, but the need to strengthen party dictatorship until it led to the abolishment of even those freedoms of activity which in one fashion or another had been granted by the bourgeois state. However, Stalin, too, can offer the excuse of necessity. In order to find other arguments against Stalinism than his personal dislike for a competitor in intra-party struggles, Trotsky must discover and construct political differences between himself and Stalin, and between Stalin and Lenin, in order to support his assertion that without Stalin, things would have been different in Russia and elsewhere. There could not have been any, quote, theoretical difference between Lenin and Stalin, as the only theoretical work bearing the name of Stalin had been inspired and supervised by Lenin. And if Stalin's, quote, nature craved the centralized party machine, it was Lenin who constructed the perfect machine for him. So that on that score, too, no differences could arise. In fact, as long as Lenin was active, Stalin was no trouble to him, however troublesome he may have been to, quote, the number 2 Bolshevik, Trotsky. Still, in order for Trotsky to explain the, quote, Soviet thermidor, there must be a difference between Leninism and Stalinism, provided, of course, there was such a thermidor. On this point, Trotsky has brought forth various ideas as to when it took place, but in his Stalin biography, he ignores the question of time in favor of the simple statement that it had something to do with the, quote, increasing privileges for the bureaucracy, end quote. However, this only brings us back to the early period of the Bolshevik dictatorship, which found Lenin and Trotsky engaged in creating the state bureaucracy and increasing its efficiency by increasing its privileges. Competitors for power. The fact that the relentless struggle for position came into the open only after Lenin's death suggests something other than the Soviet thermidor. It simply indicates that by that time, the Bolshevik state was of sufficient strength or was in a position to disregard to a certain degree both the Russian masses and the international bourgeoisie. The developing bureaucracy began to feel sure that Russia was theirs for the keeps. The fight for the plums of the revolution entered its more general and serious stage. All adversaries in this struggle stressed the need of dictatorship in view of the unsolved internal frictions between workers, peasants, the economic and technological backwardness of the country as a whole, and the constant danger of attack from the outside. But within this setting of dictatorship, all sorts of arguments could be raised. The power struggle within the developing ruling class expressed itself in policy proposals either for or against the interests of the peasants, either for or against the limitation of factory councils, either for or against an offensive policy on the international front. High-sounding theories were expounded with regard to the estimation of the peasantry, the relationship between bureaucracy and revolution, the question of party generations, etc., and reached their climax in the Trotsky-Stalin controversy on the, quote, permanent revolution and the theory of, quote, socialism in one country. It is quite possible that the debaters believed their own phrases, yet, despite their theoretical differentiations, whenever they acted upon a real situation, they all acted alike. In order to suit their own needs, they naturally expressed identical things in different terms. If Trotsky rushes to the front, to all fronts in fact, he merely defends the fatherland. But Stalin, quote, is attracted by the front because here for the first time he could work with the most finished of all the administrative machines, the military machine, end quote, for which, by the way, Trotsky claims all the credit. If Trotsky pleads for discipline, he shows his iron hand. If Stalin does the same, he deals with a heavy hand. If Trotsky's bloody suppression of the Kronstadt rebellion was a tragic necessity, Stalin's suppression of the Georgian independence movement is in the manner of, quote, the great Russian Russifier riding roughshod over the rights of his own people as a nation, end quote. And vice versa, suggestions made by Trotsky are called false and counter-revolutionary by Stalin's henchmen. And when carried out under Stalin's auspices, they become additional proof of the great leader's wisdom. To understand Bolshevism and, in a narrower sense, Stalinism, it is not enough to follow the superficial and often silly controversies between Stalinists and Trotskyites. After all, the Russian Revolution embraces more than just the Bolshevik Party. The Russian Revolution was not even initiated by organized political groups, but by spontaneous reactions of the masses to the breakdown of an already precarious economic system in the wake of military defeat. The February upheavals started with the hunger riots in marketplaces, protest strikes in the factories, and the spontaneous declaration of solidarity with rioters on the part of the soldiers. But all spontaneous movements in modern history have been accompanied by organized forces. As soon as the collapse of Tsarism was imminent, organizations came to the fore with directives and definite political goals. If prior to the revolution, Lenin had stressed organization rather than spontaneity, it was because of the retarded Russian conditions, which gave the spontaneous movements a backward character. Even the politically advanced groups offered only limited programs. The industrial workers desired capitalistic reforms similar to those enjoyed by the workers in more capitalistically advanced countries. The petty bourgeoisie and the important layers of the capitalist class wanted a Western bourgeois democracy. The peasants desired land and a capitalist agriculture. Though progressive for Tsarist Russia, these demands were of the essence of bourgeois revolution. The new liberalistic February government attempted to continue the war, but it was the conditions of war against which the masses were rebelling. All promised reforms within the Russian setting of that time and with the existing imperialistic power relations were doomed to remain empty phrases. There was no way of directing the spontaneous movements into those channels desired by the government. In new upsurges, the Bolsheviks came into power, not by way of a second revolution, but by a forced change of government. This seizure of power was made easy by the lack of interest that the restless masses were showing in the existing government. The October coup, as Lenin said, quote, was easier than lifting a feather, end quote. The final victory, quote, was practically achieved by default. Not a single regiment rose to defend the Russian democracy. The struggle for supreme power over an empire that comprised 1/6 of the terrestrial globe was decided between amazingly small forces on both sides in the provinces as well in the two capital cities, end quote. Lenin. The Bolsheviks did not try to restore the old conditions in order to reform them, but declared themselves in favor of the concrete results of the conceptually backward spontaneous movements: the ending of the war, the workers' control of industry, the expropriation of the ruling classes, and the division of land. And so they stayed in power. The pre-revolutionary demands of the Russian masses had been backward for two reasons. They had long been realized in the main capitalist nations. They could no longer be realized in view of the existing world conditions. At a time when the concentration and centralization process of world capitalism had brought about the decline of bourgeois democracy almost everywhere, it was no longer possible to initiate it afresh in Russia. If laissez-faire democracy was out of the question, so were all those reforms in capital-labor relations usually related to social legislation and trade unionism. Capitalist agriculture, too, had passed beyond the breaking up of feudal estates and production for a capitalist market to the industrialization of agriculture and its consequent incorporation into the concentration process of capital. The Bolsheviks and mass spontaneity. The Bolsheviks did not claim responsibility for the revolution. The Bolsheviks gave full credit to the spontaneous movements. Of course, the Bolsheviks underlined the obvious fact that Russia's previous history, which included the Bolshevik Party, had lent some kind of vague revolutionary consciousness to the unorganized mass, and they were not backward about asserting that, without their leadership, the course of the revolution would have been different and most probably would have led to counter-revolution. Quote, had the Bolsheviks not seized power, writes Trotsky, the world would have had a Russian name for fascism 5 years before the March on Rome, end quote. But counter-revolutionary attempts on the part of the traditional powers failed not because of any conscious direction of the spontaneous movements, not because of Lenin's, quote, sharp eyes which surveyed the situation correctly, end quote, but because of the fact that these movements could not be diverted from their own course. If one wants to use the term at all, the counter-revolution possible in the Russia of 1917 was that inherent in the revolution itself. That is, in the opportunity it offered the Bolsheviks to restore a centrally directed social order for the perpetuation of the capitalistic divorce of the workers from the means of production and the consequent restoration of Russia as a competing imperialist power. During the revolution, the interests of the rebelling masses and of the Bolsheviks merged to a remarkable degree. Beyond the temporary merger, there also existed a deep unity between the socializing concepts of the Bolsheviks and the consequences of the spontaneous movements. Too backward for socialism, but also too advanced for liberal capitalism, the revolution could end only in that consistent form of capitalism which the Bolsheviks considered a precondition of socialism, namely state capitalism. By identifying themselves with a spontaneous movement they could not control, the Bolsheviks gained control over this movement as soon as it had spent itself in the realization of its immediate goals. There were many such goals differently reached in different territories. Various layers of the peasantry satisfied or failed to satisfy divergent needs and desires. Their interests, however, had no real connection with those of the proletariat. The working class itself was split into various groups with a variety of specific needs and general plans. The petty bourgeoisie had still other problems to solve. In brief, there was a spontaneous unity against the conditions of Tsarism and war, but there was no unity in regard to immediate goals and future policy. It was not too difficult for the Bolsheviks to utilize this social division for building up their own power, which finally became stronger than the whole of society because it never faced society as a whole. Like the other groups which asserted themselves within the revolution, the Bolsheviks too pressed forward to gain their particular end, the control of government. This goal reached farther than those aspired to by the others. It involved a never-ending struggle, a continuous winning and re-winning of power positions. Peasant groups settled down after dividing the land. Workers returned to the factories as wage laborers. Soldiers, unable to roam the countrysides forever, returned to the life of peasant and worker, but for the Bolsheviks, the struggle only really began with the success of the revolution. Like all governments, the Bolshevik regime involves a submission of all existing social layers to its authority. Slowly centralizing all power and control into their hands, the Bolsheviks were soon able to dictate policy. Once more, Russia became thoroughly organized in the interest of a special class, the class of privilege in the emerging system of state capitalism. The party machine. All this has nothing to do with Stalinism and, quote, Thermidor, but represents Lenin's and Trotsky's policy from the very day they came to power. Reporting to the Sixth Congress of the Soviets in 1918, Trotsky complained that, quote, not all Soviet workers have understood that our administration has been centralized and that all orders issued from above must be final. We shall be pitiless with those Soviet workers who have not yet understood. We will remove them, cast them out of our ranks, and pull them up with repressions. End quote. Trotsky. Trotsky now claims that these words were aimed at Stalin, who did not coordinate his war activity properly, and we are willing to believe him. But how much more directly must they have been aimed at all those who were not even second-rate, but had no rating at all in the Soviet hierarchy? There already existed, as Trotsky relates, quote, a sharp cleavage between the classes in motion and the interests of the party machines. Even the Bolshevik cadres, who enjoyed the benefit of exceptional revolutionary training, were definitely inclined to disregard the masses and to identify their own special interest with the interests of the machine on the very day after the monarchy was overthrown. End quote. Trotsky holds, of course, that the dangers implied in this situation were averted by Lenin's vigilance and by objective conditions which made the, quote, masses more revolutionary than the party and the party more revolutionary than its machine, end quote. But the machine was headed by Lenin. Even before the revolution, Trotsky points out the Central Committee of the party, quote, functioned almost regularly and was entirely in the hands of Lenin, end quote. And even more so after the revolution. In the spring of 1918, the, quote, ideal of democratic centralism suffered further reverses, for in effect, the power within both the government and the party became concentrated in the hands of Lenin and the immediate retinue of Bolshevik leaders who did not openly disagree with him but carried out his wishes, end quote. Trotsky. As the bureaucracy made headway, nevertheless, the emerging Stalinist machine must have been the result of an oversight on the part of Lenin. To distinguish between the ruler of the machine and the machine on the one hand, and between the machine and the mass on the other, implies that only the masses and its top leader were truly revolutionary, and that Lenin and the revolutionary masses were later betrayed by Stalin's machine, which, so to speak, made itself independent. Although Trotsky needs such distinctions to satisfy his own political interests, they have no basis in fact. Until his death, disregarding occasional remarks against the dangers of bureaucratization, which for the Bolsheviks are the equivalent of the bourgeois politicians' occasional crusades for a balanced budget, Lenin never once came out against the Bolshevik party machine and its leadership, that is, against himself. Whatever policy was decided upon received Lenin's blessing as long as he was at the helm of the machine, and he died holding that position. Lenin's democratic notions are legendary. Of course, state capitalism under Lenin was different from state capitalism under Stalin because the dictatorial powers of Stalin were greater, thanks to Lenin's attempt to build up his own. That Lenin's rule was less terroristic than Stalin's is debatable. Like Stalin, Lenin cataloged all his victims under the heading counter-revolutionary. Without comparing the statistics of those tortured and killed under both regimes, we will admit that the Bolshevik regime under Lenin and Trotsky was not strong enough to carry through such Stalinist measures as enforced collectivization and slave labor camps as a main economic and political policy. It was not design but weakness which forced Lenin and Trotsky to the so-called new economic policy, that is, to concessions to private property interests and greater lip service to democracy. Bolshevik toleration of such non-Bolshevik organizations as the social revolutionists in the early phase of Lenin's rule did not spring, as Trotsky asserts, from Lenin's democratic inclinations, but from inability to destroy all non-Bolshevik organizations at once. The totalitarian features of Lenin's Bolshevism were accumulated at the same rate at which its control and police group power grew. That they were forced upon the Bolsheviks by the counter-revolutionary activity of all non-Bolshevik labor organizations, as Trotsky maintains, cannot, of course, explain their further increase after the crushing of the various nonconformist organizations. Neither could it explain Lenin's insistence upon the enforcement of the totalitarian principles in the extra-Russian organizations of the Communist International. Trotsky, apologist for Stalinism. Unable to blame non-Bolshevik organizations entirely for Lenin's dictatorship, Trotsky tells, quote, those theoreticians who attempt to prove that the present totalitarian regime of the USSR is due to the ugly nature of Bolshevism itself, end quote, that forget the years of civil war, quote, which laid an indelible impress on the Soviet government by virtue of the fact that very many of the administrators, a considerable layer of them, had become accustomed to command and demanded unconditional submission to their orders. End quote. Stalin, too, he continues, quote, was molded by the environment and the circumstances of the Civil War, along with the entire group that later helped him to establish his personal dictatorship. End quote. The Civil War, however, was initiated by the international bourgeoisie, and thus the ugly sides of Bolshevism under Lenin as well as under Stalin find their chief and final cause in capital's enmity to Bolshevism, which, if it is a monster, is only a reluctant monster, killing and torturing in mere self-defense. And so, if only in a roundabout way, Trotsky's Bolshevism, despite its saturation with hatred for Stalin, leads in the end merely to a defense of Stalinism as the only possible self-defense for Trotsky. This explains the superficiality of the ideological differences between Stalinism and Trotsky. The impossibility of attacking Stalin without attacking Lenin helps to explain furthermore Trotsky's great difficulties as an oppositionist. Trotsky's own past and the theories precluded on his part the initiation of a movement to the left of Stalinism and condemned Trotskyism to remain a mere collecting agency for unsuccessful Bolsheviks. As such, it could maintain itself outside of Russia because of the ceaseless competitive struggles for power and positions within the so-called communist world movement. But it could not achieve significance, for it had nothing to offer but the replacement of one set of politicians by another. The Trotskyist defense of Russia in the Second World War was consistent with all the previous policies of this, Stalin's most bitter but also most loyal opposition. Trotsky's defense of Stalinism does not exhaust itself with showing how the Civil War transformed the Bolsheviks from servants into masters of the working class. He points to the more important fact that it is, quote, the bureaucracy's law of life and death to guard the nationalization of the means of production and of the land, end quote. This means that, quote, in spite of the most monstrous bureaucratic distortions, the class basis of the USSR remains proletarian, end quote. For a while, we notice, Stalin had Trotsky worried. In 1921, Lenin had been disturbed by the question as to whether the new economic policy was merely a tactic or an evolution. Because the new economic policy released private capitalistic tendencies, Trotsky saw in the growing Stalinist bureaucracy, quote, nothing else than the first stage of bourgeois restoration, end quote. But his worries were unfounded. Quote, the struggle against equality and the establishment of very deep social differentiations has so far been unable to eliminate the socialist consciousness of the masses or the nationalization of the means of production in the land, which are the basic social conquests of the revolution, end quote. Stalin, of course, had nothing to do with this, for, quote, the Russian Thermidor would have undoubtedly opened a new era of bourgeois rule. Stalin, of course, had nothing to do with this, for, quote, the Russian Thermidor would have undoubtedly opened a new era of bourgeois rule if that rule had not proved obsolete throughout the world, end quote. The result, state capitalism. With this last statement of Trotsky's, we approach the essence of the matter under discussion. We have said before that the concrete results of the revolution of 1917 were neither socialistic nor bourgeois, but state capitalistic. It was Trotsky's belief that Stalin would destroy the state capitalist nature of the economy in favor of a bourgeois economy. This was to be the Thermidor. The decay of bourgeois economy all over the world prevented Stalin from bringing this about. Excuse me, that's so fucking nasty. It was Trotsky's belief that Stalin would destroy the state capitalist nature of the economy in favor of a bourgeois economy. This was to be the Thermidor. The decay of bourgeois economy all over the world prevented Stalin from bringing this about. All he could do was to introduce the ugly features of his personal dictatorship into that society which had been brought into existence by Lenin and Trotsky. In this way, and despite of the fact that Stalin still occupies the Kremlin, Trotskyism has triumphed over Stalinism. It all depends on an equation of state capitalism with socialism. And although some of Trotsky's disciples have recently found it impossible to continue making the equation, Trotsky was bound to it, for it is the beginning and the end of Leninism, and in a wider sense of the whole of the social democratic world movement, of which Leninism was only the more realistic part. Realistic, that is, with regard to Russia. What was and still is understood by this movement under, quote, the quote, workers' state is governmental rule by the party. What is meant by socialism is the nationalization of the means of production. By adding control of the economy to the political control of the government, the totalitarian rule over all of the society emerges in full. The government secures its totalitarian rule by way of the party, which maintains the social hierarchy and is itself a hierarchical institution. The idea of, quote, socialism is now in the process of becoming discredited. This idea of, quote, socialism is now in the process of becoming discredited, but only because of the experience of Russia and similar, if less extensive, experiences in other countries. Prior to 1914, what was meant by the seizure of power, either peacefully or violently, was the seizure of the government machinery, replacing a given set of administrators and lawmakers with another set. Economically, the anarchy, in quotes, of the capitalist market was to be replaced by a planned production under the control of the state. As the socialist state would by definition be a just state, being itself controlled by the masses by way of democratic processes, there was no reason to accept that its decisions would run counter to socialistic ideals. This theory was sufficient to organize parts of the working class into more or less powerful parties. The theory of socialism boiled down to the demand for centralized economic planning in the interest of all. This centralization process, inherent in capital accumulation itself, was regarded as a socialistic tendency. The growing influence of labor within the state machinery was hailed as a step in the direction of socialism. But actually, the centralization process of capital indicated something else than its self-transformation into social property. It was identical with the destruction of laissez-faire economy, and therefore with the end of the traditional business cycle as the regulator of the economy. With the beginning of the 20th century, the character of capitalism changed. From that time on, it found itself under permanent crisis conditions which could not be resolved by the automatic, in quotes, working of the market. Monopolistic regulations, state interferences, national policies shifted the burden of the crisis to the capitalistically underprivileged in the world economy. All economic policy became imperialistic policy, culminating twice in worldwide conflagrations. In this situation, to reconstruct a broken down political and economic system meant to adapt it to these new conditions. The Bolshevik theory of socialization fitted this need in an admirable way. In order to restore the national power of Russia, it was necessary to do in a radical fashion what in Western nations had been merely an evolutionary process. Even then, it would take time to close the gap between the Russian economy and the Western powers. While the ideology of the socialist movement served well as protection, meanwhile, the ideology of the socialist movement served well as protection, the socialist origin of Bolshevism made it particularly fitted for the state capitalist reconstruction of Russia. Its organizational principles, which had turned the party into a well-functioning institution, would reestablish order in the country as well. The Bolsheviks, of course, were convinced that they were building in Russia. The Bolsheviks, of course, were convinced that what they were building in Russia was, if not socialism, at least the next best thing to socialism, for they were completing the process which in the Western nations was still only the main trend of development. They had abolished the market economy and expropriated the bourgeoisie. They also had gained complete control over the government. For the Russian workers, however, nothing had changed. They were merely faced by another set of bosses, politicians, and indoctrinators. Their position equaled the workers' position in all capitalist countries during times of war. State capitalism is a war economy, and all extra-Russian economic systems transform themselves into war economies, into state capitalistic systems fitted to the imperialistic needs of modern capitalism. Other nations did not copy all the innovations of Russian state capitalism, but only those best suited to their specific needs. The Second World War led to the further unfolding of state capitalism on a worldwide scale. The peculiarities of the various nations and their special situation within the world power frame provided a great variety of developmental processes towards state capitalism. The fact that state capitalism and fascism did not and do not grow everywhere in a uniform manner provided Trotsky with the argument of the basic difference between Bolshevism, fascism, and capitalism plain and simple. This argument necessarily stresses superficialities of social development. In all essential aspects, all three of these systems are identical and represent only various stages of the same development. A development which aims at manipulating the mass of the population by dictatorial governments in a more or less authoritarian fashion. In order to secure the government and the privileged social layers which support it, and to enable those governments to participate in the international economy of today by preparing for war, waging war, and profiting by war. Trotsky could not permit himself to recognize in Bolshevism one aspect of the worldwide trend towards a fascist world economy. Quote, fascist is in quotes there, so, Let me reread that with the quotes intonation. Trotsky could not permit himself to recognize in Bolshevism one aspect of the worldwide trend towards a, quote, fascist world economy. As late as 1940, he held the view that Bolshevism prevented the rise of fascism in Russia in 1917. It should have long since been clear, however, that all that Lenin and Trotsky prevented in Russia was the use of a non-Marxian ideology for the, quote, fascist reconstruction of Russia. Because the Marxian ideology of Bolshevism merely serves state capitalistic ends, it too has been discredited. From any point of view that goes beyond the capitalist system of exploitation, Stalinism and Trotskyism are both relics of the past.